So thank you very much for this very kind introduction, and it's really an honor for me and a big pleasure for me to be here and to talk to you. It's a little challenging mission for me because in a very short amount of time, I need to cover a lot of things, and I was just working for the last 10 days on the recent updates on the field of information security and the Russian internet regulation, and a lot of interesting updates. So what I will try to do is, first of all, to cover the most important events and the most important factors that related to international information regulation policy by Russia, and then to introduce, in the limited time that I have, some kind of conceptual considerations about how the Russian internet regulation policy can be analyzed, relying on the first part of my presentation. But first, let me just to frame and to put the current discussion in the context, because just this morning I had a wonderful discussion with students of Monroe about the Russian internal internet regulation. So there are different forms of regulation we can talk about the internal and external one, the legal framework about the law and the legal framework of regulation and informal forms of regulation, the attributed and non-attributed forms of regulation. And actually my PhD is focused on another form of regulation, which is based on differentiation between regulation of communication and regulation of activity that is mediated through online. So my PhD project at London School of Economics is more focused on how crowdsourcing systems are used in order to control or in order to create independent forms of activity as a response of natural disasters. But these are also can be approached as a different forms of power and different forms of internet regulation when it's focused not on communication online, but on facilitation of offline activity, relying on internet platforms, and in particular on crowdsourcing platforms. But my talk today will focus on external form of regulation and Russian international policy about internet control. So let me first start with a very important differentiation, which is kind of the major differentiation if we talk about the Western and the Russian approach, with a focus on the American, US-based and Russian approach on what is understood as internet regulation and information and international policy for regulation of the internet. Because what we can see in many cases that actually the people who have these negotiations about internet regulation, they use the same words, they use the same concepts, but they have a very different meanings. So sometimes the problem is lack of dialogue, not only because of problems of translation, and many things are lost in translations, but what is lost in translations is not only the literal translation of words, but also the cultural and historical roots of different concepts that applied as a part of this dialogue by different sides. So when Russia talks about internet regulation on international level, they talk primarily about what they call international information security, or what is called in Russian международная информационная безопасность. So international information security, what you can see immediately in this concept is that it's not mentioning internet, and it doesn't mention anything that's related to any kind of cyber space or cyber security, what we'll see immediately in the American-based concept, but it talks about information. It talks about information space. What does it mean? And it talks about security. So these are two important things. It focuses on security and it focuses on information. So first of all, information security talks about applying information within a context of military conflicts. And the Russian position is primarily concerned about how state actors apply and use information as a part of contest between states. We also can see that it deals with what they call as a socio-cultural impact. So it's not about only infrastructure, it's not about only targeting specific online targets, but it's about impact on socio-political environment that can be conducted and managed through these information systems. That also define information security for information society. This is something that has been taken from definition of a common concept of information security by Shanghai Cooperation Organization that I will mention later. So they talk about a condition of protection of individual, society, state, and their interests from destructive and other negative influences in information space. And the last important thing that when they talk about information security, they try to focus not only on the infrastructure, but also on regulation of the flow of content, which is, again, is pretty different if you compare it to what we can see in the Western approach, which is supported by the United States. So first of all, according to American concept, we can see that it's focused on cybersecurity and not on information. So it's focused on cyberspace, not on this vague understanding of information that includes mass media and different form of information. It's also limited to what is defined by Russian scholar, the media to the range of digital technologies that primarily defined and based on a binary code, and it doesn't recognize the importance of addressing the content, but it's focused on the infrastructure. So if we conclude the differences in these two concepts, the Russian concept have a very vague understanding and broad understanding of information. It talks about information warfare and about state-to-state relationship, when the American approach is kind of more limited, and it talks about cybersecurity, and it talks about only infrastructure, and it tries to limit understanding of cybersecurity to very specific issues. What is also interesting is that Russia is very passive when it's talking about internet governance. It doesn't mention internet governance as a concept that is promoted by Russian side. Again, they talk about international information security. Internet governance as an independent concept is not promoted by Russian official actors. You can see a Russian Internet Governance Forum. There are some kind of internet governance conferences and discussions, but again, as an official concept that appear in different documents and as a formal position of Russia on international arena, the major focus on information security and not on the internet governance. So if we can conclude these differences, there is a very interesting and good matrix that was introduced by these two scholars, Yakushev and Demidov from Moscow-based Peer Center, when they try to map the different policies according to the relationship between the actors. So therefore, different type of relationships. When the citizens are attackers and the citizens are the target, so it's citizen to citizen, and it's more kind of focused on cybercrime. There is states-to-states situation when it's more about cyber conflicts and wars. There is situation of citizens against states, and then it's cybercrime and cyber terrorism. And there is a situation of states against citizens, for instance, situation when state-affiliated bloggers attack some independent websites, or when state use different forms of internal regulation in order to restrict the citizens. So the Russian approach is heavily focused on the state-to-state relationship. Unlike the focus of the American international policy on this field, that is more focused on citizen-to-state, for instance, cybercrime and cyber terrorism, or citizen-to-citizens, but try to kind of exclude the state-to-state relationship on the field of internet regulation from the international negotiation. So this is a kind of general difference, which is very, very big, and there are many cultural historical roots that I mentioned to these differences, but when you follow the discussion that takes place for the last 10 years or even more, still these are the major differences between the Russian position and the actors that are affiliated with Russia, and the position of the United States and the Western actors that can be affiliated with the states. What are the major threats that can be kind of identified behind this thinking about focus on information security and regulation of state-to-state relationship as a part of information security concept? So the first significant event that can be mentioned is obviously the Orange Revolution, so-called Orange Revolution that took place in Ukraine. which is used now as a major concept from Russian point of view for external influence and interfere in the internal relationship. The other one is the situations of cyber conflicts between Russia and Estonia, and later Russia and Georgia during Russian-Georgian war in 2008. The Twitter revolutions in Moldova and Iran are also another type of threat that used as a case study for threats. So maybe some of you don't know, but actually a few months before the events in Iran in 2009, not really similar, but some kind of Twitter facilitated events and social media facilitated events took place in Chisinau and Chisinau in Moldova. Obviously, the events of Arab Spring can be found a lot in this discourse about the threats and about the state-to-state relationship online. The London riots as another type of event that justify introduction of regulation in order to limit the capacity of criminal actors to act against state. And also, obviously, the creation of cyber virus activities against Iran during last 2 years, and the case of Snowden, which is used by Russia as another proof that the internet is used as a tool of surveillance and tool of information warfare, and also kind of expose the real nature of internet freedom concept from Russian point of view. So these are just few examples of what Russian officials say about the internet. So the President Medvedev told following Arab Spring that this type of scenario is prepared, was also prepared for us. And there are different type of people that affiliated with Russian security elite that talk about the danger of internet, in particular in context of the other states trying to interfere inside the internal relationship of Russia. Again, I will not read all of them, but you can imagine that the messages are pretty similar. And Oleg Demidov concludes and says that after the riots in Iran and Moldova in 2009, the discourse of ICTs, primarily social networks, as the major engine of the unrest and Arab Spring became dominant for politicians, experts, and mass media. It was described as a weapon of mass destruction that threatens stability and security of some states and the international community. So it's interesting that really we can see that this discourse become more and more dominant, and it can be approached as some kind of form of discourse that linked to the concept of international information security. Another type of expressions that can be expressed and can be found in the different declarations by people from Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs focused on the necessity of regulation of information warfare and information weapons, similar to the necessity to regulate nuclear weapons after the World War II. So the same type of things have been told from the end of 90s by former Minister of Foreign Affairs Igor Ivanov, and also the special representative for these issues, Andrei Krutskih, who represents Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs on this field of negotiation for information security. So they talk about the threat about lack of regulation, and that can be compared again to the threat of the nuclear weapons impact. And another very significant person on this field, General Vladislav Sherstuk, head of the Institute for Information Security Problems at Moscow State University, and former advisor and deputy chief of Security Council, former chief of FAPSI, that was in 90s, like similar to NSA structure. Again, he talks about the increase in race of cyber arms, and we can see that in all these expressions, the focus is on the state-to-state relationship and the regulation of information warfare. So to conclude this part, I would like to say that we can see that internally and externally, Russia really put a lot of efforts on framing the internet as some type of threat. So I had just this morning, as I mentioned, a discussion about the internal forms of framing internet as a threat that focused on child protection, suicide attacks and facilitation of internet, the role of the internet to promotion of suicides and drug distribution, pornography, cybercrime. So once Russian authorities internally frame the internet as a source of all these threats, they have more legitimacy and more support to introduce different forms of internet regulation. And the Russian public opinion shows that the majority of Russian people support internet censorship. So externally, Russia also frames the internet and invests a lot of efforts in framing the internet as a source of threat. If it's about information warfare, information operations against states, and also cyber terrorism and cybercrime. So all this discourse is focused on framing the internet as a source of threat if it's about internally or externally. At the same time, we could see that for last 5-6 years, we can see a lot of negotiations and disputes about the role of the internet between United States and Russia, and a lot of different types of opinion that obviously relies on this very different understanding of the forms of regulation and the role of regulation on the this international arena. So the U.S. approach is more focused on law enforcement, about facilitation of cooperation between security services that deal with cybercrime, and the U.S. argues that there is no necessity to regulate the state-to-state relationship, but as I mentioned earlier, the focus is to citizen-to-state and to cooperation between states in order to work on the prevention of cybercrime. And as a part of this effort, probably one of the most important documents that was introduced on this field so far, so it can be mentioned, the Convention on Cybercrime that was introduced in Budapest more than 10 years ago. But then for a few years, many different states joined to this convention. Russia, at the first stage, decided to join it, but then it decided to withdraw from this convention. And the major reason is the Article 32.b that allows the states to access data on the servers of other states without concern and notion of the states. So from Russian point of view, the major problem about the Convention on Cybercrime is that it challenged the traditional form of sovereignty. It's something that again, can legitimize intervention in internal affairs of the state, and therefore Russia says that the Cybercrime Convention is not legitimate and it cannot be, Russia never agreed to join to Cybercrime Convention. And many documents and many projects on this field can be understood as a form of alternative to what has been signed and suggested in Budapest. Obviously, the US discourse on these things is dominated by internet freedom discourse. So we can see that from the point of view of arguments that can be affiliated with the stance on internet freedom, the response to Russian initiatives is that the major purpose of the Russian initiatives is not about preventing the dangers of state-to-state relationship, but increasing the capacity of states to regulate internet inside and the limit political freedom of people. And therefore, this is just one example of this type of US-based responses by Assistant Secretary Posner. So what they say that the major purpose and the true purpose of Russian initiatives is not a regulation of information warfare, but again is about domination, is about capacity to control the situation inside the country. And what they also say that according to Russian broad approach, any mass media blog, a personal account can be considered as an information weapon. So this type of approach actually expands the range of possible interpretations of what can be considered as a threat to a very broad field that can be manipulated, used in order to restrict freedom internally and externally. At the same time, we also can see that there are many types of Cold War-related issues between Russia and the United States that can be identified in these discourses. First of all, Russians mentioned many times that still internet is a technological project of that can be affiliated with the United States because it was created by DARPA. They like to mention that ICANN is an organization that was created or controlled or at least act as a part of agreement with Ministry of Trade of the United States. They again talk about Internet Freedom Initiative as actually political initiative that legitimize interference of states inside relationship, inside situations in other countries. They mentioned the strategic communication concept by Department of Defense as another form of actually using information as a part of information warfare. They talk about the very recent international strategy for cyberspace that was introduced by DoD as something that legitimizes using information warfare and information weapons as a part of military conflicts, including establishment of cyber command as a part of US military. Also, they talk about what started as initiatives in time of Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy James Glassman when he created online teams for engagement with bloggers in order to kind of use internet for the purpose of the soft power of the United States and as a part of public diplomacy. So they have a range of, a long list of cases that justify this kind of argument that actually internet is used by the United States internationally for political purposes. And many experts, for instance, my good colleague Alexei Sidorenko says that significant politicization of the internet favors the authoritarian regimes that seek to increase internet controls. And what happened with internet freedom concept is that actually when the states and Secretary Clinton, who gave 2 speeches on this issue, actually framed the internet as something that related to internet freedom, automatically internet freedom was linked to foreign policy of the United States, and therefore now the internet freedom concept is approached by other actors as a part of political interests of the United States, and therefore it kind of considered as a threat, and therefore other states that, as mentioned, are kind of more authoritarian regimes get some kind of legitimacy in order to act against internet freedom as a political concept that promoted by the United States in favor of US interests. There is another few topics that should be mentioned in order to understand the Russian international policy. First of all, we all know about a very famous concept of multi-stakeholderism that applied to internet governance. So in this case, Russia is very bad in applying internet multi-stakeholderism, because when we talk about the internal multi-stakeholderism, so the development of internet-related policy is very dominated by ministries, by security services, by a Ministry of Communication, by presidential administration, but the private actors or commercial actors have a very limited impact. And externally, again, Russia focus is heavily on state actors. Russia is a part of GEC, the segment that introduced the state actors within ICANN, but at the same time, Russia kind of opposed ICANN because it's not really a state-focused organization. And as a part of this negotiation of information security regime, also Russia is heavily focused, as we could see, on this state-to-state approach. And in this context, it's important also to mention that Russia traditionally opposed the role of ICANN in internet governance and support the role of ITU, again, because ITU is state-focused organization when ICANN is more kind of multi-stakeholderism-based organization. The recent development on this field was introduced during the conference for World Conference on International Communications in Dubai, when Russia actually had a very radical concept that introduced the notion of sovereignty and capacity of the state actors to control everything that is related to information space. And again, they use this very vague concept of information space on the sovereign territory of the state. But what was actually interesting about this proposal is that it made a lot of noise and made a lot of kind of discussions before the conference when it was leaked. But at this conference itself, it was kind of removed from the agenda to some extent because of the discussion before the conference and because of the leak. The interesting thing that Russia had actually 2 concepts of proposal for this conference. The first one was prepared according to the Russian sources, by presidential administration that is kind of more political and have more links to security services in this case. And the second one was prepared by Ministry of Communication, which was kind of updated and more soft version of the first one. So the one that was leaked was the first version that created a lot of problems and scandals around it. And then the Ministry of Communication tried to soften it and to make it kind of more flexible, but still it was not good enough in order to raise it and to gain some influence for Russian position within the conference. So it's interesting that within Russia we can see even some struggles and some very significant differences in opinions between internal actors. Another very interesting specific case is that actually sometimes Russia tries to present a liberal position and to try to argue that it can create an alternative for the US approach. So about 2 years ago, I participated in a meeting with the President Medvedev, with Russian internet leaders. We were about 10 people. And we had a very interesting 3 years, 3 years, it would be too long, 3 hours of discussion. And one of the major issues of this discussion was about the copyright rights and the role of Creative Commons. And President Medvedev, he was the president at this time, now as we know he is prime minister, President Medvedev told that he's very supportive for Creative Commons standard. We also should remember that President Medvedev has a legal education, so he actually expressed a lot of interest in everything that was related to law. And he kind of, you can see in discussion with him, when you talk about legal stuff, he's very connected and very engaged, and when it's about political, so he was kind of less engaged. So he told that he's going to introduce the Creative Commons, as we know, something that was developed here in the United States, but by non-state actors and supported by different institutions, including Berkman Center and Harvard. So he's going to introduce it inside Russia, and also he's going to try to convince the G20 leadership to use Creative Commons as a part of international regulation, as a kind of alternative for SOPA and PIPA and all the regulation for copyright that was promoted here in the United States. And he actually published this later message to the G20 leaders about Creative Commons. Also, he kind of, we had some information inside Russia about introduction of Creative Commons in the legal system of Russia. Eventually, nothing happened, not inside Russia, not externally. But it was, I think it was interesting because it was again kind of an attempt to frame Russia as an alternative source of policy for regulation of internet. But eventually Russia also voted for some kind of new legislation that's much closer to ideas of SIPA than PIPA and SOPA, but not this type of legislation that will recognize the importance of Creative Commons and the free sharing of information. Just a few words about actors. So there are many actors that kind of alternative to the general international community, and Russia seeks different types of coalitions around internet regulation. So one of these type of coalitions is the country of BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. The Commonwealth of Independent States is an important actor, but probably the most important one is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization that established by Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Russia, and a few other members joined later. So we can see that most of the documents are promoted through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and this is the leading actor for introduction of majority of Russian proposals on cybersecurity that support this concept of information security. But as I mentioned, it's also important to recognize that there are some internal contradictions inside Russia, and there are different actors inside Russia, and also different actors inside the United States. So just briefly, I would like to mention that every year there is a very interesting meeting that takes place in Germany, which is a Russian sponsored conference for internet security regulation. And we can see that like people who more affiliated with the security community in states and in Russia have much more common language and much more agreement when, than, for instance, people from State Department and people from Russian delegation in UN. because they're dominated by different type of visions. So after this conference, you can see this type of headlines and inter-conference signs of agreement appear between US and Russia, but it's primarily because it's a different type of people that meet each other. Because if you, like the American military people and Russian military people meet each other, they're all concerned about the same kind of dangers, so it's easier for them to find common language. So is Russia and US getting closer? Yes and no. We can see some signs of talking about state-to-state relationship regulation of cyber warfare inside the US-based documents, but still at the same time, they're very different positions, as it was framed by Demidov. Still, the US is focused more on soft power and no any agreements without commitment. Focus on cyberspace and not information space, still focusing only on internet and infrastructure, and still focusing not on state actors, not on UN, but organizations like ICANN and more multi-stakeholderism approach. So there are kind of signs, but still there are a lot of differences. Very briefly, just to say that all this story that was just told here is kind of can be seen in a variety of documents that were introduced in Russia during the last 15 years. The basic document, the first document that was signed by President Putin, actually it was the first document that was signed by him as a president in 2000, is Information Security Doctrine. And then it's interesting that most of the solutions that Russia wants to promote in UN is promoted through the first UN Committee for Security, when the states try to focus on the second committee. So even the regulation of the internet is maintained through different committees and alternative versions of UN resolutions, like here in 2010. This one is focused on security, on international security, and this is focused on global culture of cybersecurity. They use different language and different terminology. And the current documents, so Russia has the Convention on International Information Security as a concept that they try to promote. They submitted a code of conduct to United Nations. That is another document. I'm not going too deep into the details because, again, there are many interesting differences, but we don't have time for it. But it's interesting to follow the development of Russian position through these documents, and also regional documents, the Shanghai cooperation-based documents, and the local documents like the Russian conceptual views on the activity of the Russian Federation by Russian military here, or very recently a document of the strategy for cybersecurity to 2020 that was signed by President Putin. What is really visible in all these documents, again, that the idea of sovereignty is very important, the capacity of state control to what's going inside the country, and for instance, different US-based and international experts like Milton Miller criticize this type of concepts for trying to protect national sovereignty, and again try to use these documents in order to justify internal censorship. I will skip this one, and just a very interesting thing. Can you recognize this guy? Can you imagine who this guy is here? These guys really have a very significant importance today on the discourse about international security, in particular in Russia, but also internationally. This is Yevgeny Kaspersky, when he was a KGB officer. So actually Kaspersky is one of the major people internationally and inside Russia who kind of, because of the Kaspersky virus company, who is kind of also a big research lab for investigation of threats that related to internet, but also one of the biggest supporters of introduction of what is called the driver license for internet and different ways of restriction internet anonymity. And again, it doesn't mean that Kaspersky company does something bad. It does just mean that this is a major tool that supports Russian claims about internet as a source of threat because of many investigations that conducted by Kaspersky lab as a part of also development of their products. It is something that supports Russian claims about internet as a very dangerous environment and environment that is used by states in order to attack other states. And this is just the, as I mentioned, the very recent document, Foundations of State Policy for 2020, that identify 4 types of threats, which is information weapons, cyber terrorism, cybercrime, And what is really important is using ICT in order to interfere in internal state of affairs and threaten social order. This is the last document that I want to mention. This is the very last one. It was submitted to UN just about 10 days ago as a part of the first committee. It's a document that updates the UN and suggests a point for discussion on the agenda of the next session, or 69th session of the United Nations. What is interesting in this document is, first of all, that it's supported not only by traditional supporters like Russia, China, and the coalition of states that affiliated with these actors, but also by Brazil and Argentina. And also the interesting thing that in this document we can find a mix of the sovereignty discourse, but also mentioning the human rights and fundamental freedom. So we can see that some kind of mix of positions that more affiliated with the Western approach and probably promoted by Brazil and countries that not traditionally affiliated with Russia. So this is kind of new type of anti-US coalition that emerged, and to some extent, as Russian newspaper Kommersant argued today about this document, that what the person who helped to create this new coalition was Snowden, who kind of supported this unusual coalition between countries that usually were not cooperating around introducing new forms of internet regulation. Now, in a short time that I have, I would like to just introduce a few very brief notions about how we can conceptualize these things, and also to mention actually something that appears in the title of my talk, to make a very brief comparative analysis with between Russian policy about internet and Russian policy about the regulation of the area of the North Pole. So first, when I was thinking how we can conceptualize these things, one of the concepts that I found really useful is a concept of sovereignty by Krasner, because I think that the four elements that identified by Krasner of sovereignty can be very interestingly applied for facilitation of thinking about how internet regulation can be addressed in order to increase the sovereignty and capacity of the countries to control whatever going on the territory of the country. I don't have too much time to go inside the concept, but just international legal sovereignty is the legal environment that allows states to recognize each other. The Westphalian sovereignty is the concept that focused on avoiding interference of other countries inside the affairs of a specific country. The domestic sovereignty is about internal legitimacy of the state to control what's going on inside the country. And the interdependent sovereignty is about controlling the flow of information and the flow of goods and different type of things between the borders, between different countries. So what I'm trying to argue is that, first of all, we obviously cannot separate internal and external forms of sovereignty, and we cannot differentiate between external and internal forms of internet regulation. Because when Russia is so heavily focused on the argument about internet and Westphalian regulation, Westphalian sovereignty, and the purpose of the internet regulation as a form that should avoid interference of other countries inside the internal affairs of a particular country. So obviously Russia also concerned about the capacity for domestic sovereignty to control what's going inside the country. And we can see how actually the international legal environment and the legal sovereignty is used to frame the arguments about Westphalian sovereignty. And then actually it should be used in order to control flow information based on cyberspace and to allow the freedom of action within the domestic environment and to increase the capacity of the government to control what's going on inside the country. So all these things are obviously interrelated, and that's why we really need to analyze the internal and external forms of regulation as one field, and they cannot be separated in this discussion. But what I'm really interested to mention in the last 10 minutes of my talk is actually that we can even go beyond focusing on the internet, and we should think about trying to see how the Russian policy on internet regulation can be found, the same type of strategies can be found in other sectors of Russian policy. So the same year when Russia introduced this very recent document for Russian policy for internet regulation for 2020, Russia and President Putin signed another document which is about controlling and the Russian policy for development of the North Pole area. Which includes a lot of interesting points, but I would like to try to make very brief comparison between these two documents and to say that there are kind of joint common denominators in Russian approach to these two areas. First, my argument says that actually there are a lot of similar things about the internet and the North Pole. These are both unexplored, changing environments because North Pole is changing due to environmental factors. There are also scientific investigations that change the understanding of the structure of North Pole and consequently the structure of sovereignty. And what we can see in both cases, case of the North Pole and case of the internet, when you have the unregulated environments, you have environments of certain degree with certain degree of uncertainty about these environments. So you also can see a special focus of the state actors in order to regulate and to introduce a specific policy in order to address this lack of regulation and also to avoid potential conflicts on the one hand and introduce the notion of sovereignty in regard to this space on the other hand. So what happened with the North Pole recently, actually, that Russia tries on the one hand to expand its sovereignty over North Pole by claiming that there are some underwater areas that belong to Russia, and they invest a lot of money and different type of resources in order to prove that this huge area, which is about more than 1 million square kilometers, is belong to Russia. So there are special missions that investigate the seabed, special ships and submarines that go there in order to prove the Russian claim about sovereignty and to draw the borders of where the Russian territory goes through the North Pole. And we can see the policy, which is a very interesting type of policy of trying to kind of put the flag in different places, including we know this picture familiar for you, the American flag on the moon. So this is the Russian special mission plant the flag on the North Pole. And the same thing that happened with the Olympic, I forgot what's the Olympic torch? Olympic torch, thank you. The Olympic torch, which recently was placed in the North Pole and just 2 days ago in space. So there is an attempt to use the symbols of country to frame the sovereignty relying on the symbols. And we can see the similar type of thing of trying to frame the space of Russia inside the internet, of actually planting the flags inside the virtual space. Another element of policy of Russia in regard to North Pole is trying to exclude the actors that can talk about the North Pole. So there is an agreement between a few countries that have immediate access to North Pole to exclude other actors from discussion about what's going on with North Pole. So this is kind of the anti-multi-stakeholderism version of regulation of this area that introduced in the case of North Pole. So, and the very recent case, which is really interesting, about the North Pole is when a Russian scholar from the Higher School of Economics, Sergei Medvedev, wrote on his Facebook that he thinks that actually the Arctic area is a very unique environmental zone and it should be transferred to international control. So this small Facebook status was attracted attention of President Putin, who said that this professor is a totally stupid person, and this is something that will remain forever the part of the Russian territory. And some other Russian Kremlin-affiliated people told that actually this professor is an enemy of the state, and etc. So we can see a lot of discussion about the borders of sovereignty and how the spaces should be regulated. So in order to conclude and introduce my understanding of how this comparison can be analyzed, I would like to mention a concept that called the concept of limited statehood. It's a concept that introduced by a German scholar, Thomas Riese, and developed by a number of scholars. And it talks about the capacity of the state to control and use force and to control the ability to implement and enforce the monopoly of force and political decisions in some particular places, and if it's deficient or if it's limited or not. So what I'm trying to argue that in case of Russia, there are a number of reasons why the statehood of Russia is challenged, and the capacity of Russia in general to control what's going on in territory of Russia is challenged. And the spaces, these contested spaces as North Pole or the internet, are used in order to construct the symbolic notion of statehood through very active policy that argues that sovereignty should be identified in these spaces. So what's happening, for instance, there is a very famous notion of political construction as a symbolic construction that's called Potemkin village in Russia that starts from the times of Ekaterina II, when arguably they created fake villages in order to show it to foreign guests. So the internet as an area of limited statehood is also an environment where the state can actually define and in very kind of demonstrated way and very visible way to argue that this is our territory. And the same thing about the area of the North Pole. So what I'm trying to argue that the statehood is manifested through margins. The statehood is defined in contested areas, and these new spaces are used by state in order to create the symbolic construction of statehood. And that's why the regulation of internet from the point of view of Russian authorities is a political project that tries to send the message that we are there, that we have the power, we have the capacity, and we have the resources to implement our sovereignty in these areas. So just to conclude, to the same extent, we can see that on the one hand, there are many problems about the development of the zone of North Pole, and actually the state is not there, but on the political level, Russia is very active there. And we can identify actually the major elements when it's on the one hand, trying to define what belongs to us, and on the other hand, saying that the rest should be managed by international community. So there is a balance between external and internal. The same model can be identified in management and trying to implement this information security concept to regulation of internet, when on the one hand, Russia tries to define what are the borders and limits of the Russian sovereignty and to draw literally the borders online, and on the other hand, to argue that the rest of the territory should be managed by international legal framework in order to kind of avoid any conflicts and any misunderstandings. And these are two types of contested areas. So just to conclude, and this is my last slide. So first of all, we can identify that both Russian internal and external policy are driven by this concept of construction of the internet as a source of different types of threats. So if it's internally about protection of children, about pornography, about drugs, about promotion of suicide attacks, or externally about this danger of warfare, about state-to-state conflicts. But also, internet is one of the case studies for addressing new and contested spaces, as well as in the case of the Arctic area. And here, the internet as a subject of regulation is actually a project for construction of symbolic statehood. That's where the state tries to draw the border between what belongs to us and what should be regulated internationally, when the framework of international regulation is also something that is suggested by Russia as a part of this notion that Russia had the capacity to regulate it and to have the power to introduce this framework. What is also interesting and can conclude this point is that actually, if we see that the same model is applied to the North Pole and to the internet, there is some kind of geospatial notion of internet as space, because we can see this attempt to put the borders and to say this is the international space and this is our space, and the same geospatial model applied to internet and applied to the regulation of what's going on with the North Pole. Now, I should say that these are just an ideas under development. I think that there is something there. I think there are still a lot of very kind of arguable issues that should be debated. But I think that what is really important is to put the discussion about internet regulation beyond the context only of discussion about internet and technology, and to try to find some kind of other spaces and other dimensions of international policy where the common denominators with internet regulation can be found, and it will help to understand what's going on with regulation of internet, and it will help to expand the understanding of not only Russian policy, but generally the policy of state actors in regard to regulation of internet. So I will conclude here. I know that it took more time than it should be, but I think we still have a few minutes for questions, if I'm right. Thank you.
I'm just worried that you didn't cover enough ground. That's a joke.
Yes. I have two questions, and my guess is that they're related. I really welcome the approach of thinking of kind of the construction of symbolic space in terms of sovereignty, and geopolitics, and all that. But I'm wondering if the case of the North Pole is not a bit different from the internet, in the sense that, if it can be argued, and it can be argued that the architecture of the internet is to a large extent a creation, at least initially, of the US. The North Pole area, you have geographical contiguity, so the Norways and the Russias and the Canadas of the world have completely different calculations than others, right? They are right there. So to what extent is that difference consequential? And to what extent, if we take that difference into account, does it undermine your desire to compare the two?
So if I can just respond
Yeah.
first. So I think that one of my slides mentioned excluding the actors who deal with this issue, because generally one of the arguments that took place around this discussion was that this model that's similar to the Antarctic zone should be applied also to Arctic zone, when all the states, because it's considered to be as a humanity area, like I don't remember what the definition in English, but it belongs to all humanity, and the same argument, like some countries were playing with this argument, and Russia was a very significant actor with some other countries, including the US, in order to exclude not only generally all the states, including China, who is trying to collaborate with Iceland and try to kind of to put its leg there, but generally to exclude even countries that traditionally were considered as a part of the circle of countries that should discuss it. So I think that this kind of multi-stakeholder model, very limited model, is still there, and to some extent, yes, it's very different, and it's different in many dimensions. But I think that there's also some kind of similarity about this conflict about what type of actors and how many actors should be excluded or included in discussion around regulation. You had the second question.
Just very quickly. The other question is, to me, this echoes the debate about television 30 years ago about the free flow versus prior consent.
Yeah.
With the difference that this exposes the hypocrisy between the actual rhetoric and also, so the question can be asked: who cares about all of this when we know, if the Snowden revelations are right, all of this doesn't matter, right? It's the sheer brute power of the ability to hack and capture information and violate these structures that really matters. Why do we care about all the debates about and all the agreements and all the architecture, the legal architecture, the normative architecture that's put in place?
Let me leave it as a comment. I think it's a legitimate comment to make. I don't want to enter to I think it's interesting, but at the same time, eventually, first of all, if you approach it as from constructivist point of view, that's something that frame the field of action, and that's something that actually frame the field of action, not only state actors, but also private actors. So I think it does matter, at least because that's what creates the reality that we act within. So I think that it has a very significant impact on the environment, and it's about, again, framing the space and framing the environment geographically and symbolically.
I guess I have similar reactions to Marwan's. maybe with a slightly different thrust, which is to say that I wonder if the comparison to sovereignty is occurring at the right place in terms of the structure of your argument. And it seems to me that the comparison with physical sovereignty is part of the attempts to conceptualize how internet should be regulated on the part of all kinds of actors, and that the analysis of it should be pushed down into the object material and not used as a tool, which is to say that they are very different cases. And it's like, as we all know, internet is about the disaggregation of all kinds of effects with regard to information and political action across space in ways which don't match up with traditional models of sovereignty and state control over territory, and that it's a problem with regard to the articulation of policy or legislation that models which are related to the organization of space are being applied to a place, to a kind of activity in which space plays a completely different role. So that, you know, pushing the question of physical territory and sovereignty down into the material and questioning how these modes, these scripts, are being applied by actors in the development of policy would make more sense to me than positioning it as an argumentation tool on the part of the interpreter who's going to say, okay, I'm going to compare the Arctic versus the, you know, it seems like that's the wrong level of analysis for making the observation that these two things are related. And then to follow up on that, once you push it down to the object of analysis, then you can start to question whether specific actors are utilizing the, you know, confusing metaphor of physical sovereignty when they discuss internet sovereignty in good faith or bad faith ways, right? It seems to me that on the one hand, it's a question, it's a confusion which creates all kinds of confusions in states and other actors' attempts to articulate internet policy. It's also a confusion which allows states to take certain specific policy positions and actions with regard to their own citizens. In the case of Russia, the claim to have internet sovereignty is a way of externalizing certain kinds of political action within internet space within Russia, right? So all of this discussion about external threats and the necessity of, you know, regulating external threats in terms of our political life, which is related, I think, you know, the best example would be, I'll be as quick as I can, during the 2011 protests where there's continuous outcry on the part of Russian policymakers and political leaders that all of the sort of protest activity is stuff which is being organized from abroad by Hillary Clinton and the State Department. This is, you know, a tool, this confusion between the physical and the virtual, which allows the state to identify certain kinds of action, which is actually physical action, protest action, and turn it into virtual action, and say that it's coming from outside of the state. So that, I mean, it seems to me that like pushing it down into the material would be the appropriate place to put the question of physical versus virtual sovereignty.
I think I agree with you. So maybe I was kind of not really successful in communicating my argument, because what I'm trying to do here is deconstruct the Russian position, which is kind of a subjective position and which is rooted in the Russian notion. So, and this comparison is actually an effort to deconstruct the kind of, I don't want to judge it if it's a wrong understanding or right understanding of what it's about, but that's the Russian understanding. And that's why this similarity is in particular interesting for me, because it helps to kind of decode and deconstruct the Russian notion of regulation and international policy and how this type of environment should be regulated. So I think I totally agree with the things that you told. Maybe I was kind of not really successful in communicating my message and my kind of idea, but here what I try to do is to try to deconstruct the Russian position relying on this comparison.
I'm delighted. I think this whole issue, I think it's interesting to disassociate this a bit with the Arctic example, but if you take China and you take the whole global debate, it's not as if this is a made-up debate over sovereignty and the sort of confinement of internet space. It's real, it's not virtual. And the question of how it will be sort of adapted by various governments is an important kind of question. So I think that's, I'm very glad we discussed it. And I commend this sort of analysis of the 2012 basic principles, which I think incorporates a lot of this stuff.
So you ask me about the...
Maybe you could say a word about the 2012 thing and
so
then we'll stop.
Yeah, I think, so just go back to slide of 2012 principles. So I think just the important thing is that the importance of 2012 principles, first of all, is internal for Russia, because there are a lot of different documents in Russia, as we could see. There are a lot of different departments and different ministries and different institutions inside Russia. So I think the first importance of these principles is that it's something that kind of creates common denominator for different Russian institutions inside Russia, if it's about the security services and about Minister of Communication and other actors. I think what is not there again, so we could see some mentioning of human rights and some kind of international stuff inside the recent convention. It's not in this concept. It's also still focused on very kind of, it's the structure of threats is again something that is pretty traditional for Russian approach, and we can see this for obviously the issue of internal interference. But what is really interesting is that it's focused on the promotion of regulation of internet through this regional coalitions with the focus of Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And it's also differentiate between convention, which is a hard law, and rule of conduct, which is a soft law, as the two forms of international regulation. And it looks like that Russia will try to do both and to see where it's more successful, if it's a rule of conduct, which is kind of soft thing, or convention, which is something that is with a commitment from state actors. And the last thing, which I kind of skipped, but the regime for non-proliferation of information weapons, I think something that we can expect that Russia will try also to add some kind of adjustments to Geneva Convention and to existing Convention for Regulation of Welfare as a substitute to a failure to introduce an independent concept of information security. So this is another thing that we can expect relying on this policy that was introduced this year. So I think it's a very useful tool for trying to estimate how the Russian policy will look like. But still, I think it will be grounded and rooted with the same concepts and with the same notions that we could see 10 years ago, because it's very heavily politically and culturally and historically linked to very specific concepts that were introduced in my talk.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.